Chapter 8. I don't dream. Really? Nope. Never? Well, sometimes I remember. Cap leaned back in his chair. What's it like? Newman shrugged. Remembering is remembering, he said in a faraway voice. Does it happen often? What? The remembering? Newman turned and looked at the old man. You're one of those that attach great importance to dreams. Cap nodded. I am. I told you I don't dream. I asked about your remembering. It happens. Cap looked at him with piercing eyes. When does it happen? Newman seemed distant, as if his mind was busy with another problem far away from his subterranean prison. Cap had noticed the mood descend shortly after Newman's session with Patricia. An hour later, he walked into the quarters to try and take advantage of it. After I first wake up in the morning? Really? I wake up and sometimes they come. His voice drifted off again. What do you remember? Newman's eyes glazed over. His body drooped. Pain. What do you remember? I remember school. And school is pain? No. But school is related to the pain. It was a statement, not a question. Yes. Newman fidgeted, then stood and walked over to the stereo. He began to fiddle with the knobs. How is school related to pain? Cap said gently. Newman crouched, checking the station on the radio dial. How is school related to pain? School, he said without turning around, is where I first noticed it. The pain? He shook his head. The difference. Cap nodded slightly. Being different in school can be most painful. Newman stood staring at the bookshelf as if it was a window through which he could see. They wanted to party, to smoke, to drink, to screw. Your classmates? They didn't care about anything, didn't know anything. They grew their hair long, wore wild clothes, flaunted any authority they could find, did everything they could to rebel against. Hell, I doubt they even had any idea what it was they were rebelling against. Newman paused. But gosh, they did it all so effortlessly. And you? Nothing was effortless. Go on. Newman turned back to Cap. You think you can get inside me? He smiled, a tired smile. Maybe this once. He chuckled. We'll call it an experiment, right? Nothing was effortless for you, Cap repeated. I was clumsy, awkward, hopelessly naive, never good in crowds. His voice trailed off as the faraway expression returned. By the time I was 10, I had read and understood the works of Keats, Shelley, and Byron, had read the original text of Stoker's Dracula and Benet's Nightmare at Noon, even looked at the stars and understand what they were, where they were, and what they meant. His voice trailed off, but I couldn't look a girl in the eye. An eclectic knowledge, Cap said in a friendly fashion. Not really, Newman shook his head, just a hopeless but incompetent romantic. He smiled spasmodically. I can remember standing in the yard, looking up at the Canis venacti, the hunting dogs. He looked over at Cap. The old man nodded. I have seen the constellation. Newman smiled warmly. I love dogs, he said softly. I used to turn to the hunting dogs on fall nights when they would be the most visible and talk to them. I'd tell them my problems, wait for their advice. Cap seemed pleased. And did you take their advice? Newman looked at him sadly. Do I hear the voices of dogs telling me what to do? He chuckled. Doctor, please. My apologies. You were shy around girls. Newman stared at Cap for about a minute, then continued. The foster families I grew up in were never terribly good at showing emotions, not positively anyway. So I was painfully shy. He paused again. This is the kind of stuff you want to hear? I wouldn't want to disappoint you. You were shy, Cap said slowly. You were not confident, and nothing was effortless. I realized early on that I didn't see things the way they all did. It was like I was given more vision than any of them. They didn't see, they didn't care, didn't understand why I did. What'd you care about? Nothing. What'd you see that they could not? Nothing. You were different? Newman raised his eyebrows. Was I? How? Newman hesitated before answering. I wore my hair very short, wore conservative, solid-colored clothes, walked with my head down, sat by myself, kept to myself. Why? I didn't want anyone to notice. Notice what? That I was different. Cap thought for a moment, then nodded. And if they saw that cosmetic difference, he said. Newman smiled. Then they wouldn't look for the other. He sat down on the couch, but it didn't matter anyway. After a while, I just stopped going to school. Where'd you go? Newman laughed, a deep, hearty laugh. Would you believe the library? I would, but weren't you ever caught? Rarely. Why not? Your foster parents surely were good people, but they both worked, and they relied on me to go. Trust, I believe you call it. He paused. I used to be an accomplished liar, Doctor. Remarkably so. No longer? No need. Why? My feelings exactly. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. But the school authorities, Cap ventured, didn't they ever contact your foster parents? Again the spasmodic smile. Occasionally. Once or twice a semester, after I'd been gone for 5 or 6 weeks. No more? I said. I was different. He stood and began to pace. I saw things, understood things that no one else seemed to. What did you understand? This time the smile seemed almost reluctant, almost painful. That to understand a bureaucracy is to control it. Newman paused as if he expected Cap to understand it all. When it was clear this wasn't happening, he shook his head and continued. I did a series of experiments, attending some classes, skipping others, keeping elaborate charts on when I got caught, how, after how long. Simple, really. And you were how old? I don't know, 10, 11 maybe? Cap was silent for a very long time. And the pain? What pain? In your memories at the moment of waking? Newman looked genuinely confused. Why, Doctor, whatever are you talking about? The loudspeaker cut off any further discussion. Dr. Cap, an unseen voice called. Yes, he sounded irritated. You are wanted at the conference, sir. Reluctantly, Cap nodded. Newman walked him halfway to the door. I hope I wasn't too boring, he said. Cap shook his head, a sad expression spreading across his ancient face. Mr. Newman, he said slowly, as if against his own will, I wonder if you are truly as complex as you would have us believe. Newman shrugged. Complex is a relative term. The wheel would be considered complex in a society without wheels. Routine is one with. They heard the locks being thrown. And in our society, Mr. Newman, among the people here, which are you? Newman's face lost all expression. His eyes seemed to drain of color as a stillness settled over him. As the door was opening, he turned, starting back for the bedroom. Watch and learn, Doctor, he said as he went. Watch and learn. Upstairs, the conference with the review board had been going on for 2 hours by the time Cap joined it. The review board paid professional attention to every word, and despite their comical code names, Mr. Red, White, Blue, Green, and Ms. Gray, they at least appeared to understand what was being said. Step by step, with meticulous Germanic precision, Tabbert took the board through every test and every result that had been obtained. He carefully avoided expressing any opinion or looking it back. His presentation was clear, thorough, unbiased. An hour and a half after Cap arrived, Tabbert wrapped up. This concludes the strictly medical portion of our studies, he said as he looked the board over. If you have any questions? Dr. Tabbert, the man known only as Mr. Red, asked, have all possibilities of a mass lesion or cerebral injury been eliminated? Conclusively, sir. Mr. Green spoke next. Any chance of a randomly occurring phenomenon, such as an intermittently thrown embolus accounting for the behavior changes? None, sir. Can you diagnose any injuries or trauma sustained by Newman during his captivity? Mr. Blue's voice was terse. Only those accounted for in the files turned over to us. It would appear that they are most forthright. All right, Mr. White said, making a note. Let's move on. Very well, Ms. Gray said, checking her agenda. Dr. Clemente is next with an overview of the psychiatric aspects. She looked over at Clemente, who was in a whisper conversation with Patricia and Cap. Dr. Clemente? He nodded at Patricia and Cap, both upset, then turned to the review board. You have my report. There is very little to add to it, except perhaps to reinforce several key points. At no time since he was placed in our custody and control has Mr. Newman demonstrated atavistic tendencies or decompensation lability syndrome. Quite the opposite, in fact. He has been mostly cooperative, demonstrated a willingness, however reluctant, to abide within our rules, and has asserted his personality in vivid acts. All this in direct contraindication of DLS. How do you explain the discrepancy from the original diagnosis? White asked. Clemente thought for a moment. Either it was wholly wrong, or the stress that caused the decompensation in the first place has been sufficiently reduced. Rather like lowering the flame under a pot of boiling water. But, Red pushed, he is still in close custody, still unable to do as he pleases. Clemente nodded, but he understands this as a temporary condition, that while he might not consider us friends, we are certainly not the enemy. Proceed, Red said, making a note. Despite the lack of direct evidence of DLS, despite no direct atavistic primitive behavioral outbreaks. What about the cat? This from Gray. Seems pretty primitive behavior to me, Red said sharply. Clemente bit his lower lip. The cat, yes. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I do not believe that this one incident was in and of itself a determinant in any way. Except the cat, Blue said under his breath. If, and I stress that word, Ms. Gray said firmly, DLS and phased atavism are not the diagnosis, what is? We cannot say, Clemente said slowly, with complete confidence at this time. Is he psychotic? It's hard to say, he might be. Is he schizophrenic? Red asked. I don't believe so. Is he paranoid? Green said with a skeptical look. Perhaps, within certain definitions, he is certainly cautious. Is he sociopathic? Red tried. Seems unlikely, but remains a possibility. Miss Gray shook her head. You cannot say with confidence. He might be. You don't believe so. Perhaps. It seems unlikely. She paused. Doctor, what do you know? At that moment, Clemente was overtaken by a coughing fit. Cap poured him some water. The coughing continued, worsening by the second. The color drained from the man's face as his handkerchief was stained a thin crimson. Cap helped Clemente to his feet and, along with Patricia, walked him to the door. Two of the junior staffers took him at that point, leading him out toward a waiting nurse. But before he would leave, Clemente turned to Cap. Take over, please, Otto. Cap nodded as the dying man was taken away. He and Patricia returned to their table. He checked his notes, glanced at Clemente's, and faced the board. The board had politely found other things to look at until Cap returned. Lady and gentlemen, our apologies, but Dr. Clemente has not been well for some time. Perhaps I can answer your questions? Mr. Red nodded. That would be refreshing. Cap checked some notes he had made. I believe you can best be helped to understand Mr. Newman's condition by exclusion. He paused. He has not demonstrated regressive behavior, inappropriate moods, delusions, or hallucinations. He has shown no loss of contact with reality or any disintegration of his core personality. While the incident with the cat suggests the lack of impulse control, when that event is taken in perspective, it is clear that he has demonstrated great impulse control. The cat would then be more appropriately placed in a category of chosen behavior for a specific effect, not an impulsive act. The board was making copious notes. Calf took a sip of coffee, carefully studied their faces, then continued. As we have eliminated basic psychosis, we must also eliminate schizophrenia, again, because he simply does not display the appropriate symptomology. As for paranoia, he evinces no delusions of grandeur or persecution beyond that which, in my opinion, any individual who has done what he has and has been treated as he has would naturally display. Is he a sociopath? Only by the strictest definition. He displays no conscience. His intelligence is high, but, this is critical, he does display a marked moral sensibility. He started to gesture as he talked. They may not be your morals or mine or those of any of our acquaintances, but he does possess them. Mr. Blue looked up. So, where does that leave us? Cap shrugged. With either a new, hereto undefined psychiatric or medical ailment involving both the conscience centers and the behavior centers of the brain, or... Yes. He paused and made his decision. or a new man. To Patricia's shock, the board sat there placidly making notes. Cap looked at them closely, then merely nodded his head slightly. But then he said quietly, "I believe you already considered that possibility." Patricia leaned over to him and whispered, "Otto, what do you think?" Cap never took his eyes off the board. "Look at them," he said to Patricia in a conversational voice. "They must have suspected all along. They merely looked to us to confirm or deny their suspicions." He paused as the shocked psychiatrist behind him looked over at the review board. "Gentlemen." "Proceed, doctor," Ms. Gray said quietly. Cap leaned back in his chair. "Dr. Nelwyn will continue with the presentation at this time." As she began, Cap observed the board's tacit confession of the truth, then looked at Patricia, eyes aglow with the prospect of acceptance, advancement, and a major paper that would shake the psychiatric and anthropological worlds to their foundations. Then he thought of Newman, a man incredibly racked with an unknown mental disease that threatened to tear him apart, or the first of a new breed of cold-hearted men that would have to battle for their very survival against the species that they must inevitably replace. And it occurred to him at that moment, in that room of experts, healers, professionals, and specialists, that he was the only one thinking of Newman. He tried to concentrate on Patricia's presentation, but a wave of sadness engulfed him, making concentration nearly impossible. 3 hours later, he realized that they all had stopped talking. "Excuse me?" Mr. Blue smiled at Caff. "I was just saying, Dr. Caff, that we seem to have reached an impasse." "In what sense?" "Dr. Nolan's thesis would seem to be open to two differing interpretations, the new man postulate and the new disease conjecture." "They are not mutually exclusive," Caff quickly pointed out. "No." He shook his head. "The one is a logical extension of the other." Human beings don't live to age 300. Can't happen. The board members looked confused. A wheel in a society without wheels might well be considered aberrant, but in a more evolved, advanced world, the wheel would be considered routine. Time will diagnose Mr. Newman's disease or evolution. White shook his head. "An interesting conundrum, doctor, but I'm afraid this review board does not have the luxury of time." He turned to his colleagues. "Perhaps we should hear from the subject now." They all nodded. "I'll have him brought up," Patricia said as she reached for her phone. "One moment, please," Cap interrupted. Patricia froze, receiver in midair. "Is it essential for you to hear from Mr. Newman?" Cap asked with a hint of tension in his voice. "I think it only fair," Ms. Gray said. "What's wrong?" Patricia appeared confused. Cap stroked his beard as his mind raced. Something from his session with Newman had set off alarm bells, and they were clanging deafeningly now. Watch and learn. "Perhaps it would be more advisable, if this is absolutely necessary, for you to go down to his quarters instead." "Why?" Cap paused. "There is the security aspect to consider for one," he said in a subdued voice. "Then there is the question of how a change in environment might affect his long-term treatment." Neither was the real reason. He didn't know the real reason, but deep in his soul, he knew moving Newman would be a mistake. "Security Chief Edel?" Gray asked as she searched the room for him. Edel stood by his seat in the back of the room. "Madam, can you address Dr. Cap's first concerns?" Edel thought it over. "Since we were informed of your visit, we have had plans in place to bring Mr. Newman to this room. I will escort him personally, and he will be under the guard of 5 of my best men. If it would be more to your desires," he added, thinking as he talked, "I can have him shackled during the move and your visit, but I do not believe that will be necessary." "I agree," Patricia added. "Dr. Nelwyn." Patricia stood up and began pacing. "At this point in our analysis of the man, reshackling him as the Russians did would, in my opinion, cause him to revert to the previous defensive behaviors he apparently exhibited while in Russian custody." Mr. Red made a note. "And Dr. Cap's other concerns about a sudden change in his environment?" Patricia smiled confidently. "Negligible," she said firmly. "He might be a little reticent, a little defensive at first, but He adapts quickly. She perched on her table. I've had close to 100 sessions with the man. We've established a very special rapport, so I'll be able to spot any changes in him, any danger signals, long before anything might happen. Red turned to Cap. Doctor, watch and learn. Cap sipped his long cold coffee. He may do nothing. He may be charming and cooperative. He may be militant, aggressive, and combative. Or he may yet find a new face to display to you. Regardless, I believe the maximum steps should be taken to guard against any eventuality. Patricia was staring at him angrily. Then she turned to the review board. Bring him up in chains, and I guarantee you he'll be uncooperative. She paused. Let me talk with him, and I'm sure there will be no problems. She smiled a somehow private act. He'll listen to me. The board talked among themselves for a moment. Talk to him, Dr. Nolman, Mr. Blue said after a moment, and if you believe he's stable, bring him up. 45 minutes later, as the red-orange rays of the setting sun flooded the room through its one bay window, Newman was escorted in by Patricia Edel and 5 security men. As Newman settled himself behind a table directly in front of the review board, Patricia took Cap aside. He's fine, she said in a whisper, cooperative, polite, in a good phase right now. And you are sure of that? She smiled supportively. He recognizes that there's no gain in causing a disruption. There's a security here in the corridor, and he's almost as far above the ground floor door as he was below it. She patted Cap on the back like a grandchild might her senile old grandfather. He sees that his only possibility of gain is by being helpful, and we both know he always recognizes and exploits any chance of gain, not to mention to perform. She returned to her seat. Cap stood there, watching Newman settle himself. Perhaps, Cap muttered to himself. General Beck, Miss Gray looked at the tired man in the corner. Would you begin? Reluctantly, Beck stood and walked to a place in front of the room. Newman watched him, smiling politely. Brian, Beck began in a quiet voice. This is a review panel from the States. They're here to see how you're doing. I think you know some of them. Newman looked from Beck to the board and back again. In visions of the dark night I have dreamed of joy and departed, but a waking dream of life and light hath left me broken-hearted. The board members looked at each other. Brian, Beck tried again, will you answer their questions? What is not a dream by day to him whose eyes are cast on things around him, with a ray turned back upon the past? Beck rubbed his forehead as the board members stared. Mr. Newman? Patricia walked around to the front of the room. Brian, I thought you wanted to cooperate? I lied. She smiled, afraid they'll figure you out. Newman laughed lightly. Not likely. So, okay. Patricia nodded at Beck. Go ahead. Beck stood up again. Brian, do you remember your last mission? That holy dream, while all the world were chiding, hath cheered me as a lovely beam, a lonely spirit guiding. He turned to Patricia. I said I'd answer their questions. Beck collapsed into a chair. Patricia looked at the board and shrugged. Mr. Newman? Ms. Gray asked. Newman sat bolt upright in his chair. Ma'am. How are you feeling? Ma'am. Very well, ma'am. Gray smiled. Are you willing to answer our questions? Ma'am. Yes, ma'am. She nodded to Mr. White. Your military bearing is appreciated, Mr. Newman, but why don't we keep this a casual conversation? Okay. If you prefer, sir. Do you remember your last mission? Yes, sir. Newman was concentrating on whoever asked the questions. And would you recount it to us? Newman looked around the room. I'd prefer not to, sir. Why? Sir, with due respect, you don't tell a stranger you use whips and chains in the bedroom, and you don't talk about your missions in front of them either. White seemed pleased by the answer. If we were to meet in an executive session, would you be willing to? Absolutely, sir. White nodded to Mr. Green. During your captivity, did you ever compromise any operations or personnel of the department? No, sir. Did you ever have occasion to observe any other American personnel create such a compromise? Newman thought for a moment. Sir, I was kept isolated from other Americans throughout my ordeal. I regret I cannot furnish you with any information in that area. Green nodded and Red began. Newman, you know me. Yes, sir, I do. Let's cut out all the fucking bullshit and play acting, okay? Yes, sir. Red put down his pen, leaning forward to look Newman in the eye. Did you kill any Russian personnel in that damn camp? Newman didn't answer. Come on, Red pressed. I thought we were stopping all the game playing. Newman smiled a cold, angry smile. I'm sorry, sir. I was just remembering what you said last time we met. What was that? I believe you said that anyone who would answer a question like that must be crazy. So I'm trying to figure out exactly how to answer you. He paused. I wouldn't want to be seen as crazy, would I? Patricia walked over to him. Are you okay? Do you want to go? Newman ignored her and concentrated on Blue, who was consulting his notes. Mr. Newman, Blue said gently, do you consider yourself crazy? No, sir. Depressed or psychotic? A little depressed, sir, he said with a sigh. It isn't easy being this close to being home and still locked up and all. Why do you think you are still locked up? I'm sure you know that far better than I, sir. Ms. Gray turned to the board. Before we continue, I'd like the sense of the board. Is the subject in condition to be debriefed? Slowly, one by one, they nodded. Patricia patted Newman on the back for encouragement. Kath noted the spasmodic smile that played across Newman's lips for the briefest instant, immediately replaced by a blank open look. For the next 45 minutes they discussed Newman's background, his history up to the final mission, a mass of little things that helped the board get a clearer picture of the man. Finally, they reached the central issue of the session. All junior staffers, with the exception of Patricia, were cleared from the room. Over Cap's objections, 3 of the 5 security men were cleared out. Tape recorders were shut off, pencils put down, and the serious business began. I would like to remind you, Dr. Nowin, Dr. Kaff, Chief Edel, General Beck, Ms. Gray began slowly, and you 2 security men, that what you are about to hear is classified on the highest level. Revealing this information, or even the existence of this information, is a violation of German and American law, and is punishable as such. They all nodded. Very well. She turned to her right. Mr. Red. Newman, let's talk about Abkhaz 1-5. Newman took on a serious expression. Yes, sir. For the next 3 hours, without a break, they laboriously went over every aspect of Newman's last mission. Every day, hour in detail, reported, scrutinized, disassembled, and examined. Took its toll on everyone. The board made notes and guzzled coffee. Patricia, always hovering near Newman, finally sat down, just behind him, propping her head on her hands. Edel and his 2 security men constantly shifted their weight from one foot to another, trying to keep focused and alert. Cap, already exhausted by the tension of the day, found himself drifting off several times. Even Newman seemed not to be exempt from the tedium. He stretched his legs out in front of him, seemed a little drowsy, but continued to answer the ever-coming questions. Was it your intention to... Yes. Did you consider... In general terms, what was your state of mind when... Didn't really think about it. Finally, just before 7 p.m., Ms. Gray signaled for the last round of questioning to begin. Mr. Green. Thank you, he said, suppressing a yawn. Only 2 questions. He turned to Newman. Our satellite intel was not as specific as we would have liked. Were you able to get any kind of actual damage assessment? Newman seemed deep in thought. All I know is that I overheard a colonel from the Soviet Nuclear Commission saying that they would have to contain the remainder of the reactor in some kind of outer shell of lead and concrete, that it would have to remain offline, as would its progeny reactors. Any estimate as to the cost they were incurring as a result of the action? No, sir, Newman droned as he yawned. None. Gray turned to her right. Mr. Red. Only one question. Is it your impression that the Hago network was still intact after your arrest? Yes, sir. Mr. Blue, Gray said as she wiped at her eyes. Thank you. My questions concern what you discovered of the construction of the reactor's inner service module. Red looked at him, shook his head, and poured himself another cup of coffee. Newman stretched long and hard. This may take a while. He paused, closing his eyes while he thought. Patricia bent her head back and forth from shoulder to shoulder to try and stay awake. It was a two-stage process, Newman began. Initially, there was a chromium hatch that appeared set in a composite wall that was perpendicular to the southern bilateral retaining wall. Edel stood, took a position by the door, and signaled that it was all right for his men to sit down. The chromium hatch was set into the composite wall with 9 apparently steel rivets. Each group of 9 was set in a triangular. It was only by checking the security videotape, slowing it down to almost frame-by-frame viewing, that anyone was able to reconstruct what happened next. In a quick, spasmodic kick, Newman lifted the small table in front of him, sending it flying on top of the board table. It caught Mr. Blue and Mr. White in the upper bodies, knocking them backwards, sending the other board members flying. In almost the same movement, Newman rocked forward, quickly coming to his feet. His right hand sent the chair flying backward past his stunned Patricia and into the lap of the nearest guard. And Newman was already on the move. On a straight line toward the window, Newman smashed his forearm and elbow into Beck's forehead without slowing down. As Beck fell backward, Newman grabbed his chair, swinging it in a short, vicious arc, launching it at the window. As it shattered in a rainfall of glass splinters, Newman dropped to his knees, barely in time to avoid the first and only shot that Conrad Edel would get off. Newman rolled back to his feet and dived, arms outstretched, through the gaping hole in the window. By the time Edel got to the window, less than 10 seconds had elapsed. He thrust his smoking semi-automatic through the hole that Newman had dived through and desperately searched for a target, but it was too late. Newman was nowhere in sight. Edel and the eventual pursuers were the furthest thing from Newman's mind as he sprinted into the woods. He was functioning purely on conditioned instinct, following a plan he had rehearsed 100 times in his head over the last 3 months, and had been modifying throughout the debriefing session. He knew the distances, he knew the obstacles, now he just had to execute. He made the edge of the woods 2 seconds quicker than he had estimated. The ground was soft and moist, and he knew that would be easy to track. He instantly altered his course to a rock-strewn path that ran parallel to the edge of the woods about 100 meters in. Suddenly 2 armed security men appeared in his path, their MP-5K assault rifles pointing at his head. Newman never hesitated. "Don't shoot! Don't!" he yelled as he launched himself at them. None hesitated for one fateful second. Newman's shoulder caught the first man in the midsection like a linebacker tackle. As they tumbled to the ground, Newman grabbed the man, raising the guard's hand, still holding the deadly weapon, and forced his finger down on the trigger. The second guard died instantly as 10 9mm rounds tore through his body in a 3-second burst. Newman rolled lightly to his feet, pointing the smoking gun at the head of the prone first guard. "Run away," he said in a guttural voice. The guard hesitated, then scrambled to his feet, fleeing in the opposite direction, never seeing Newman toss the rifle aside as he took off again. The sounds of a gunfight would only serve to bring the security forces right to him, and he had no desire to kill them. As he sprinted, his eyes took in everything. He knew he had at best 30 more seconds before he would have to give up, abandon the woods, and try for the east fence. Then, miraculously, he found what he was looking for. Alarm sirens sounded throughout the compound. Edel recovered first in the commotion. He immediately punched the panic button in the conference room, then dashed for the door, shouting as he went. In less than 2 minutes, he had 10 men outside the unit, fanning out toward the woods at a dead run, guns at the ready. But he knew that Newman had disappeared into the woods at least a minute and a half before they even reached the grounds. Another 10 men were dispatched to the west fence area, and 5 more to the front gate of the Institute. By the time 5 minutes had elapsed, Edel's men had been reinforced by 25 standby guards who were split between the east fence and the woods. As he watched the heavily armed men disappear into the foliage, he prayed that Newman wouldn't kill too many of them before the night was over. 45 minutes into the search, he warily returned to the upstairs offices of the unit. Members of the review board had either left or were being treated for minor injuries in the Institute's main building. Patricia, Kapf, Tabbert, Beck, looking 90, and a white-faced, erratically breathing Clemente were sitting in the deserted conference room, silently waiting. They all looked up hopefully as Edel walked in. Edel slowly shook his head. "We have completed our first pass through the woods and are beginning a second. We have searched all open areas of the property and are now beginning a room-by-room, floor-by-floor search of the main building and all outbuildings." He collapsed into a chair. "However, since the discovery of Security Officer Brunel's body, there has been no sign." He exhaled deeply. "I am not hopeful." Kapf took a deep breath. "We must notify the authorities," he said in a steady voice. "Of what?" Tabbert asked angrily. "Technically, the man was a voluntary commitment, and we must not allow it to be known that the Institute was housing a violent, extraordinarily dangerous individual, and then allowed him to escape." He paused, taking a stiff drink from his glass of schnapps. "I was opposed to taking on this case from the beginning. I said so. I made it clear. He seemed to withdraw into himself. "Is he really dangerous?" Patricia ventured. "I mean, he's got what he wanted now, right? Maybe we're overreacting." But her tone showed that even she didn't believe it. "I thought you were supposed to be able to spot any danger signs, you stupid little—" Patricia whirled on Beck. "You trained him. Hell, you probably created him. Why didn't you see this coming?" Beck jumped to his feet. "I did not create him," he screamed. "I used him, gave him technique, direction, but damn it, I did not create him." Clemente weakly raised his hand. "Please, done is done." His voice was weak and hoarse from the almost constant coughing. "The chief is right. We cannot tell the police who Newman is." He took a sip of water. La diablo. "But we must tell them that a possibly dangerous patient has, left without our approval. We can ask them to keep a lookout but not approach him. Merely notify us if they see him." They all seemed to agree. "I will see to that," Edel said as he went to a phone. "And," Clemente said between coughs, "we must take steps to find him." Beck was rubbing the large welt on his forehead. He had refused treatment. "I've already called NATO Security Command in Augsburg," he said wearily. "They're 53 kilometers northeast of here. It's about 35 minutes away." He paused and reapplied an ice pack to his head. "They'll have 2 covert search teams here within the hour." Clemente nodded as a violent coughing fit overcame him. Kapf, who had been silent since the incident, stood and gestured for the nurse standing just outside to come in. Together they lifted Clemente into a wheelchair. She wheeled him out. Kapf followed. "Otto." He turned back to face Patricia. She was pale, trembling slightly. "Newman won't hurt anyone unless he's cornered, I'm sure of it." Her voice was beseeching him. "I know the man." Kapf nodded sadly. "So you have said." He turned and followed the nurse into the elevator. Eight hours after the escape, after the woods, the buildings, everything had been searched 5 times each, the Institute began to return to normal. It was a little after 4 in the morning. The guards had resumed their regular patrol. The special covert search teams had fanned out across the countryside, and the unit had been closed down. Everybody was sworn to secrecy and sent home. In the woods along the rock-strewn path, the night bird stirred. A sound very high up in one of the still heavily foliated trees caused it to stop, look up, then quickly wing away. Newman dropped soundlessly to the ground. He remained crouched for 5 minutes, listening, watching, smelling. His eyes narrowed, his nostrils flared, his fingers bent and tense, more like an animal's than a man's. Finally satisfied, he slowly stood up and started down the path, back toward the unit. He stood on the edge of the woods, looking at the dangerously wide-open lawn in front of him. He looked up at the gradually clearing sky, seemed to be searching for a moment, then smiled. Taking his bearing from the rising constellation Canis Venacti, the hunting dogs, he casually stepped out and began walking across the great lawn toward the main building. "Keep an eye out, guys," he said softly as he walked. As he approached the unit, some instinct caused him to stop short. He stood there at the ready as an indistinct darkness rose up out of the ground in front of him. A man in his 30s and powerfully built tossed aside his boulder camouflaged tarpaulin and turned to face Newman. In his left hand, he lightly cradled a Randall assault knife with brass knuckles. Newman nodded at him. "I don't know you. Since your time, I expect," the man said evenly. "Let's do it." "I don't have to," Newman said as he took a step toward the man. "I have nothing against you." The man took a hesitant step toward Newman. "I have my orders." The man lunged forward, a snake-like strike at Newman's throat. Newman dropped straight down, shooting his right leg forward as he fell. Catching the tip of his foot behind the upright man's ankle, he pulled. The man fell backward. Newman rolled to his right, bringing his left arm in a short, tight whirl toward the man's head. Less than a second later, the man lay dying, his larynx and windpipe crushed, unable to make a sound or move as his lungs filled with blood. Newman stood up, looked around, then brushed off his clothes. "Pity," was all he said as he stepped around the drowning man